Ms. Marsha Diamond, and I'm the new Business Development with Alluserv. And thank you for your time today. We have with us Rich Gallagher, the President of Point of Contact, and a psychotherapist, and I'm sure he'll give you a little bit more about his background before he gets started. But I did want to give you some housekeeping tips. The webinar will be available for on YouTube as well as on Alluserv website. This is 1 CEU credit, and the certificate of participation will be located on Alluserv's website early next week as well. And any other questions, you'll have my contact information and you can send me back. Again, housekeeping tips, this recording will be available on the Alluserv website as well as YouTube. The certificate of participation will be located on the Alluserv website. And please take the questionnaire at the end of the program as well, which helps us make our programs better and gets more information out to you. Again, thank you for joining the Alluserv July webinar, and good afternoon. Let me just make sure my screen is full. Okay, screen, and okay. Okay, we're going to get started. Okay, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcia, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see such a great crowd of people here. I want to thank Marcia, and I also want to thank Alluserv for hosting me today. As Marcia says, I'm a former customer service executive. I'm a practicing psychotherapist, author of 2 #1 customer service bestsellers, including the one we're talking about today, which is the Customer Service Survival Kit, which just launched this March from Amicom Books. And so I want to jump right in today and talk about what the single biggest issue that you folks brought up to Marcia when we were preparing for this webinar, which is the whole question of how do I motivate my employees to give good service? And in fact, a lot of you were much more blunt than that. You were saying things like, how do I hold my employees accountable? How do I stop my employees from being rude and indifferent and entitled and convince them to create good service and hold them accountable? And there's actually some very interesting behavioral science behind that. I'm going to draw a parallel to bullying in schools, for example. They've done studies that show that if you ask bullies to stop bullying, that doesn't do much of anything. If you punish bullies, it doesn't do much for them either. But if you teach them skills, if you take them in a classroom and teach them how to raise a rabbit or a baby, bullying drops by 60%. As a practicing marriage and family therapist, I see a very similar dynamic with families. The couplet of a very critical parent and an unmotivated kid is practically the common cold of family therapy. And I would say, as a former longtime manager, that the couplet of a very critical manager and an unmotivated employee is a very similar dynamic as well. So if you're thinking about how do I hold employees accountable, I actually think you're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. What's worked really well for me, both as a manager in the food service industry and in life, is teaching people customer skills and coaching them on them, and teaching them new skills that they've never had before. I have a bias in this situation in the sense that I love worst-case customer situations because, to me, they're the bedrock of what gives people excellent service. And in my history of dramatically turning around the performance of customer contact operations, teaching people the same kind of skills that hostage negotiators, crisis counselors, psychotherapists, and police officers use in their worst situations is the key that I've used to creating dramatic changes in performance. Not asking people to work harder, not asking them to be nicer, but actually teaching them life skills that change the way that they feel in a difficult customer situation. One of the things that is really important to understand is that the roots of most bad service isn't in rudeness or indifference, but actually it's in fear. Even though really tough customer situations only happen a small fraction of the time, because people worry about twisting in the wind in their most difficult customer situations, that leads people to handle most customers from a defensive posture that then governs what you say, governs what you do, and, listen carefully, actually causes most difficult customer situations, as well as the kind of bad attitudes that sometimes you see among your employees. And what I find is that when I train and coach people how to handle their very worst situations, that changes everything about how people act, how they feel, and what they think about themselves and you when they walk in the door every morning. So before I teach you anything today, and we're going to be teaching a lot hopefully in this next hour, I'm going to turn things back over to Marcia and bring up a poll about how you folks handle your worst customer situation. So, Marcia, I'm going to send things back over to you.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so we've got a polling question with 4 choices here, which is how you guys handle a really upset customer. Marcia's going to be bringing the poll up, and our choices are, do you ask them to calm down? Do you try to explain the situation? Do you apologize for what's bothering them? Or do you acknowledge how they're feeling? All of them seem like pretty legitimate answers, and I'll be interested to see how you folks answer this.
Okay, okay. So how do you handle a really upset customer? And by a show of hands, how many do you ask them to calm down first?
Okay, and what kind of responses look like we're getting on that one?
We have about 4. Okay?
All right.
How about explain the situation?
Okay, and how's that looking?
About 3.
Okay.
How about apologize for what is bothering them?
Apologies usually seem like a good thing. And
So
how
by
many do we
show
have?
of hands, how many people? About 12.
Okay.
And acknowledge their emotions.
Okay, and what do we have for that one?
Now we're seeing the hands go up, and I can tell you.
Okay, and what's that looking like?
38, 39, 40, 41, 40, about 40.
All right. So I got a big smile on my face here because that's exactly the right answer, and that's exactly what I would want to see. So here's the point I really want to make as I take control back here, is that whenever I give polls like this and put up choices like this, almost everybody gives exactly the right answer. But if you look critically at your most difficult customer situations, almost nobody actually does those things. And I'm going to drill down into the reasons why that is and teach you some skills that will help you motor past that speed bump. In reality, if you look at a difficult customer situation, then what you're going to find is that people almost always talk past each other, even when they're trying. A customer will say, I want X, and then the customer service person will say, okay, well, I can do Y, or I can't do Y. And we never, ever acknowledge the other person. Okay, so if I could have control back here, I'm going to move on to the next slide and start teaching you a few techniques for this.
Cool, yours.
Okay, I do not have control here, so
Okay.
I'll have you tee up the next slide for me.
See if it's there.
Okay. Excuse the slight break during technical difficulties while we're waiting for the next slide.
There.
Well, okay, thank you very much. And one of the points I want to make here is one of the reasons I love doing what I do. I teach about 5,000 people per year how to handle their very worst customer situations. And when I teach people techniques like how to really acknowledge people, then what I find is that it's as pure as the driven snow. Most people have no idea how to do this. These are skills that nobody knows until they've been taught. And when I do role-playing on them, they're understood by approximately nobody. Those few people who really do get it, when I scratch the surface, it turns out that they're people like trained therapists or mediators or police officers, people who have actually had training on how to handle critical situations. And my belief is that everybody who works with the public should learn these kind of skills. And so what I'm going to talk about today is 4 very specific named techniques that you can use for your worst situations. We're going to talk about how to defuse criticism. One of the most important things we're going to cover is the mechanics of how you really hear and acknowledge people, which is not the same as agreeing with them, and there's always the first club out of your bag in terms of making sure that people feel heard and felt and have a good experience with you. Then we're going to crank up the heat a little more and talk about how to deliver bad news to people, especially in a food service environment. And then finally, crank the heat up even higher and talk about how you deal with angry and intimidating people, which is what most people think of as difficult customer transactions. So now if I can move to the next slide, I'm going to jump into the very next technique, which is how you defuse criticism by leaning into it. And here's a good example of why this is so important. I was just flying home from a vacation on the West Coast this week, and my flight home got delayed, and I was standing on line. This is for a major airline in the U.S., and I was standing behind a woman whose flight had just gotten canceled. And she was very angry about it and very sarcastic and kind of browbeating the gate agent. That gate agent sat there like a block of ice, and doing that made the other person even angrier and made her even more belligerent. And I'm standing behind the both of them thinking, I know what to say here. So what we're going to talk about is a technique that you can use to actually lean in to the other person's emotions and the other person's view of the world. And what a remarkable job that does of defusing all the heat in the transaction and shifting both of you rapidly into problem solving. So if I could have the next slide, I'm going to start walking you through some of the mechanics of it. First, I want to give you a little bit of theory here, which is this is based on a technique that psychotherapists are taught very early in their graduate work. We refer to it as the disarming technique. It was first popularized by Dr. David Burns, who wrote the bestseller Feeling Good. I went through this exercise myself in graduate school, and it was a life-changing experience. What they do is that people who know you gather around when you're an intern and criticize your therapy work, and your job in the exercise is to acknowledge or agree with them with as much gusto as possible. So they would say things like, you know, Richie did a lousy job with that client last week, and my response would be, well, you should have seen me last week. I was even worse than that. In fact, listen to what I said to this person. It was horrible. And then at the end of the exercise, people gather around and debrief you on how much power and dignity you had by completely owning how they felt. And so the principle is when somebody's shooting flames at you, I want you to walk into those flames and crank the heat even higher. I want you to actually match or exceed the kind of emotion they're feeling. And I want you to paint their view of the world as the view of a perfectly reasonable person. Listen carefully, even if you violently disagree with them. And I could break this down into 4 mechanics. One is to hand their complaint back to them. The second is to use wow language that meets them where they're at emotionally. Taking things that you're worried they're going to say and saying them first and getting there to the head of the line. And then finally, there are times when you do have to defend yourself, but the key here is never, ever do it first, which is something that every fiber of our body wants to do when we're being criticized. That's our human nature. So now let's move to the next slide and
Richard,
take a look.
Richard, I think you can do it. See if it works for you.
Okay, let's take a look at that. Sure enough, there's that arrow, and I am back. That's great. Okay, so I'm driving again, and so the next thing you do is paraphrase what a customer is saying. This is a technique that's part of what we call active listening or reflective listening. Dates back about 40 years to Dr. Carl Rogers, one of the fathers of personality psychology. It's a totally mechanical technique that you can pull out of your back pocket anytime that a customer is complaining to you. What paraphrasing is you take the customer's words, you gift trap them in your own words, and you hand those words right back to the customer. And so when the customer says, this chicken cacciatore was terrible, you can come back and say, so this meal wasn't at all what you were expecting. Clearly you wanted this to turn out differently. Paraphrasing works really well because even though it's totally mechanical and you can use it on demand anytime and it's totally brainless, what it does is it lets the other person know that you hear them, that you've processed what they're saying, and that it's safe to talk about it. And the more you gift wrap these things in your own words and play them back, the better. Remember, you're not agreeing with them. You're just handing them back their own words. So here's an example. Picture this. I was on stage in front of about 500 people about 3 years ago at a major university, and I asked them from the stage, what are some of your biggest problems? And one woman raised her hand and said, graduation audits. What happens is that somebody calls up, since they have a lot of distance learning students, and says, hi, I'm ready to graduate. And then they do an audit, and 3 weeks later it turns out that they're 2 credits short or missed a distribution requirement, and no, they're not ready to graduate. And those are really tough phone calls. So I asked somebody to come up on stage and role play that with me, and she did a wonderful job. She said, "Your stupid school messed up my plans. I've got a job in 2 weeks. This is all your fault, Rich Gallagher." And all I did was exactly what I told the audience I would do. I leaned in and paraphrased everything she was saying. So I was saying things like, "Wow, this is really inconveniencing you. You've got a job in 2 weeks. We've got to figure out a way to help you graduate as soon as possible." And she's standing there with this look of stunned silence on her face, thinking, "Hey, wait a minute. I'm trying to get angry with this guy in front of all these people, and I don't know what to say." And that's exactly the kind of outcome that I want you to have. So paraphrasing is sort of the level 0 of what you do when somebody's first throwing a complaint at you. The next part of leaning into people's criticism is to meet them where they're at emotionally and be right there with them. You don't realize this, but when somebody's angry at you, you say as little as possible and you try to minimize it. That's our human nature. That may be a good technique back in cave person days when the fight or flight reflex kicked in and we were trying to get away from a hungry brontosaurus. But when you minimize somebody's emotions nowadays, all you succeed in doing is making them angrier. So you never want to say, "Sounds like you had a little problem here." If they say something's terrible, it's horrible. So I'd be using language like, "Wow, this sounds horrible. This must have really inconvenienced you." How come people never say things like that? The reason you never hear it as a customer most of the time, except for the really good companies that dominate their industries, is because saying phrases like this sound like they're dancing dangerously close to agreeing with the angry person, but they're not. All they're doing is meeting them where they're at emotionally and saying, "I can see how you're feeling about this, and that sounds very reasonable to me that you would feel that way." It's not the same as admitting fault. It's not the same as giving in to them. It says absolutely nothing about what you're going to do or not do for them. All it does is just suck the heat out of the transaction so that you and the customer can settle down to problem solving and calm the other person down as quickly as possible. So it's an incredibly powerful technique. If we press on a step further, if you're worried about what customers might say, my advice is to just jump in and say it first. So if somebody says, the entree was cold at the event that you catered, then you might say, "Wow, this must have really put a damper on your event." Remember, you're not admitting fault. You're playing back what you think they feel. And the more that they think you get them, the better it is. People have all sorts of different personalities, and some people want to be acknowledged a lot. Some want to get right down to business. But the one reason the customer frustration turns into anger is because people feel unheard. And so your goal in proactively playing back what you think they're feeling is to make it clear to them that you get it. And the minute that they know that you do get it, then they've got nothing to fight with you about, and they have to turn their energy to problem solving. So this proactively and preemptively defuses the anger and the frustration of the other person. And then finally, when it comes to the question of, well, what if there's your side of the story? What if somebody complains that you were late, and in fact, no, you weren't late. They didn't show up on time and prepare for you. What I recommend is using what I call the look up, look down rule, which is you want to get the customer's head nodding up and down first before you start defending yourself. So in that situation where they think you were late, but it was in fact actually your fault, the first thing I'd be saying is, "Yeah, this was a big event. That must have been really frustrating. Now here's what happened from our end." And so make sure you get the customer's head nodding up and nodding down before you then jump in and explain it. This then leads very naturally to the most important thing I'm going to teach you all day today, which is how to really hear and acknowledge people. This is a skill that almost nobody has, and if you teach the people on your team to do it, which is a totally mechanical skill, they're all going to seem like superstars, no matter what their personalities are. One of the things I want to emphasize is that I've been managing customer contact teams for decades, and I have a track record of dramatically turning around the performance of those customer contact teams. And one of the things that was true throughout most of my career was, for the most part, I inherited the teams I worked with. I didn't hire them from scratch. And so I had every personality on the face of the earth. I sometimes joke about the 7 dwarfs with, Doc, Sleepy, Dopey, Grumpy, and so forth. The reality is, no matter what your personality is, if you're taught the right skills, and more importantly, if you positively coach those skills and teach people how to handle situations in ways that work better for them, then within a matter of a few weeks Everybody sounds awesome with exactly the personalities they have. And so I can break that down into 3 ways to really connect with people. The first and most important of them is how to acknowledge the other person. Another technique is how to change the language you use to make it less threatening to people. And then finally, I want to wrap up by talking about some of the well-intentioned phrases that people use that actually end up triggering people with the best of intentions. Pay attention to this slide, because this is the most important thing I'm going to teach you all day today. This is what I call the ladder of acknowledgement. This is how you walk safely into a difficult discussion with anybody about anything. It's 4 different levels. You choose one of these 4 levels that feels most appropriate to you, plug in the right words, turn the crank, and walk safely into the discussion. We already talked about the lowest level of acknowledgement, which is paraphrasing, which is that we take the other person's words and hand those words back to them to make somebody realize that you're listening to them. The next level up from there is to observe what somebody's feeling. So now you're not just playing back their words. You're taking a good guess at what they're thinking and feeling. And by the way, guessing is okay in a situation like this, and play this back to them. So instead of saying, you're upset because we were late, instead I'd be saying things like, wow, that must have been really frustrating. The next level up from there is validation. And as the name implies, validation is a big step up from observation. Instead of just saying, I see how you feel, what you're saying is, I see how you feel, and I think you have a right to feel that way. Validation is really simple, really mechanical, and it's a place where I like to live most of the time when I'm talking with people. All you need to do is just compare what they're thinking and feeling to other people. So all you need to do is just invite a big crowd into your answer before you give it and say things like, everybody hates it when the food isn't warm enough, or nobody likes it when we run out of chicken pot pie in the middle of the lunch rush. And so by validating them, you're letting them know that it's okay for them to feel that way. Listen carefully, even if you violently disagree with it or it isn't the way that you would feel. Then the highest level on this ladder of acknowledgement is identifying with other people. Here, you're putting yourself into the situation. You're still not agreeing with them, but you're talking about how you might feel in that situation to connect with and bond with the other person. So identification phrases would be things like, that would frustrate me too, or, you know, if that happened to me, I'd be furious, or what happened to you wasn't fair. Very few people use identification because, again, it feels like you're dancing dangerously close to agreeing with the other person, even though you aren't in a case like this. But it's one of the most powerful forms of acknowledgement. And if somebody's actually angry with you because they're angry because they feel unheard, it's very important to use the highest level on the ladder that you can. At the very least, validation, possibly identification. A couple of side points on acknowledgement. First of all, because the higher you go on the ladder, the better people feel, you might ask yourself, why don't we just use identification all the time? And the reason we don't is because there's at least 2 situations where it wouldn't be appropriate to use identification. One is where you can't identify with people. So if a woman comes up to me and says, I'm having a really difficult pregnancy, I'm not going to respond by saying, wow, I could just imagine what that must be like. I'm the wrong gender to do that, so I can't identify with her. The other time I can't do identification is if something crosses my boundaries. I mean, think of a police officer who's picked up somebody committing a crime. Good officers are actually trained to use a lot of empathy with people and say, hey, look, you did something stupid, you got caught, but we'll help you, you'll be okay. And the reason they do that is to keep themselves safe. But you're not going to find a police officer saying things like, well, gee, when I run out of money, I feel like knocking over a bank too. So once I had a very mild-mannered employee, really nice guy, and one morning something really bothered him, and I saw him smash his cup against the wall. So I'm not going to go up to him and say, gee, when I feel that way, I feel like smashing my cup against the wall too. Instead, I'm going to dial all the way back to observation and say, hey, Steve, you know, something's really bothering you. Let's talk about it. How you doing? So choose the right octane level, turn the crank, walk safely into the discussion. One last piece I want to mention about identification is a variant of it called the I technique, which I would paraphrase as how to tell someone they're stupid without ever using the word stupid in the sentence. This borrows from a very important principle of behavioral psychology known as modeling. We don't learn everything from scratch. We learn things by observing other people, and especially by observing people do stupid things. So if somebody goes through the tray line without paying, and you're talking to them about that, then instead of saying you did something stupid, which often leads them to push back and argue with you, you might instead say something like, I get frustrated when I do that too. Or if somebody's doing something so blitheringly stupid that you could never imagine yourself doing it, then you can still use that technique by saying, I've seen lots of other people do that. And what you're doing is you're normalizing the situation and taking the scariness out of it to make it safe to talk about it with the other person. Reframing is another technique you can use to take the heat out of a situation by using language to make things a little more palatable to the person that you're talking to. People who are in the real estate profession do this all the time. Think about how you describe a really tiny, cramped place as cozy. In this case, if you use reframing to say competitive prices instead of expensive, then if you're trying to upscale your food, this makes it a little more palatable to people when they come and talk to you about it. Here's a good example of it. I was in an auto accident a few years ago. I'd been rear-ended in my brand new car by a big truck. So here I am sitting at an auto repair shop, my brand new car crumpled like an accordion. I've got a splitting headache and whiplash, and I'm on the phone with the other guy's insurance company. And the snippy person at the other end of the line is saying, well, sir, you have to realize that lots of people need their cars fixed, and we're really busy, and it's going to be at least 3 days before somebody can get to you. It's a good thing I teach strength-based communication for a living, because I was on the verge of saying some not very strength-based things. So let's say instead that this person had reframed her language, not her reality, just the language, and said, wow, so you've been in an auto accident. I'm glad you're okay. I know you want your car fixed as quickly as possible, so I'm going to personally make sure that somebody gets in touch with you within the next 72 hours, then 3 days, by the way. If she had just changed her language, I'm going to wager that this woman, who probably goes home from work thinking that I deal with all these miserable, angry people, will probably have a totally different look on how people react to her. So you can also stretch or expand time by the units of time that you use. 24 hours sounds a lot sooner than tomorrow, or a 30-day lead time on a catering event. You can compress that by saying, we can do that within a month. The one thing that you never reframe is a customer's feelings. We talked about this earlier. You match or exceed somebody's feelings. So if somebody thinks something terrible, it's horrible. If something's big, it's huge. You maximize a customer's feelings and you minimize the things that might inconvenience them to make them feel better. Finally, the last thing on this topic about how to hear and feel other people is to avoid some of the well-intentioned trigger phrases that people use with people. When I challenge people to acknowledge people, before we teach them very specific techniques like observation or validation or identification, almost always people use the catchphrase, I understand. But when I ask audiences what happens when you use the phrase, I understand, everybody comes back in unison and says, no, you don't. And the reason for that is I understand is a catchphrase. 50 years ago, it meant exactly what it means, which is I understand you. Nowadays, if you use I understand, you're bearing the weight on your shoulders of the other person's experience, having heard that phrase for 20 years or whatever from every bored, gum-cracking clerk that's talked to them, saying, yeah, I understand, but I don't care. And so it actually works against you. One other catchphrase that might surprise you a bit is the phrase, I'm sorry. If you think about the times that you've heard I'm sorry as a customer yourself, usually the most common phrase that follows it is but. And so instead of saying I understand, use one of the ladder of acknowledgement phrases that we talked about. Observe their feeling, validate it, identify with it, or paraphrase their words. Instead of saying I'm sorry, apologies are awesome. Say, I apologize, I wish this hadn't happened, what can we do to make this right? Just don't use the catchphrase. Use any different language and you'll pretty much be okay. Here's another food service example. I was standing at a chain sandwich shop a while ago, and I was trying to gaze at the menu. I'm almost 60 years old, and I'm trying to read it here with my bifocals. And the woman behind the counter sharply pointed at the other end of the counter and said, sir, you'll have to stand over here. She did succeed in getting me to change my behavior because I walked out of the store and never came back again. Nobody has to do anything. That's a news flash here. And with the best of intentions, we sometimes use phrases that have the impact of making people feel like you're ordering them around, which almost always gets an equal and opposite reaction from them. Then there's what I call setup phrases, and another way of framing that is what I call brutal honesty, with the emphasis in the word brutal. You may think that you're preparing somebody for bad news by giving them phrases that distance yourself from them, but in fact you're preparing them for battle. So if you say things like, I hate to tell you this, but sure enough, there you are telling them anyway, or I don't know what to tell you here, then quick, find somebody who does. Those phrases do nothing but anger people, and you want to cut them out of your vocabulary and make yourself and your team aware of them. And then finally, there's distancing phrases like, we'll see, or who knows, and again, the customer is hoping that you knew, and it just makes you look really bad when you use that. So now, let's crank the heat up even a little more. What happens if you have to deliver bad news to somebody? Somebody wants you to cater an event, and you're not going to be able to make the date, or you're going to need more lead time than they want. Or somebody has a favorite dish in the menu, and they don't have it anymore. So with that, let me just move to the next slide here. Like we're going to come back here. So let's go back one slide to the polling slide, and I want to see what you folks think about how to handle this situation. Okay, and what we want to do is we're going to go back a couple of slides, one more back from here. Okay, and just one more slide back from this. Okay, and Marcia, are you back on the air yet? Hello, Marcia. Are you there?
Hello. Yes,
okay.
Yes. Unfortunately, there were some difficulties. Is everybody back, I hope?
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go back one slide from where we are, and I've got a polling question for everybody.
Okay. You want me to do it?
Yep.
Okay, back one slide?
Back one slide.
Okay, 1 second. I think with this hot weather, very hot weather, okay.
Well, I know where I am in upstate New York, there's been a lot of lightning storms around here, so, you know, who knows where we're getting cut off here. Certainly not the first time that's happened. Okay, so Marcia, take it away. I'm going to have people go through these selections and see how they would handle this situation.
What is the first thing you say to someone whose favorite item is no longer on the menu? So by a show of hands, unfortunately, this item is no longer on the menu. 2.
Okay, 2 out of 109. All right, so.
Sounds like you really like this. Here's how we make menu selections. By a hand, show of hands. Okay. About 6. The next one, more people should have purchased this. By a show of hands. 9, 10.
Okay. And then finally the last one.
I wish we could do more here. How many? The last one.
Okay. And
That's 10 too. Mm-hmm.
okay. So, and then it sounds like I've put about 40 people to sleep too. So,
Well, I think maybe some people did have connections problems.
yeah,
Hopefully everyone's back on. Okay.
I suspect so too. Hope most of you are back on because we've got some good stuff to cover up ahead. Just a couple comments on these menu choices here, which is that my favorite answer is the second of them, where you can probably tell we're acknowledging the other person, and then we're actually giving them some information that moves towards them in terms of, here's how we make these decisions, and here's how you can have some influence on that. In reality, again, I almost never hear this in real life. 99.9% of the time, people actually respond with choice number 1, number 3, or number 4. Or even worse than that. We had an example once where my wife and I went to a local ice cream stand, and we would go there every week and get an ice cream sundae for her. And one week her ice cream sundae was sour, and she took it back to the person behind the counter. He took out a spoon, took a taste of it, said, "Tastes fine to me," and walked away. 3 months later, this place went out of business and probably had no clue what kind of a reputation that this person had with customers. But when you acknowledge the other person and then give them options, that changes everything. Okay, so let me walk you through the mechanics of how you deliver bad news in a way that people won't go off on you. This uses a technique that psychologists call systematic desensitization, and it's based on the fact that when you're giving somebody bad news, you don't want to just hit them in the face with it like a cold, dead fish. Instead, you want to prepare them for the fact that you're going to say something important and use empathy to make it clear that it's you and them versus the problem instead of them versus you. And so there's a 3-step process to this. The first is to use an introduction that prepares the listener for the fact that they're going to hear something important. There's no one all-purpose introduction. I'm going to walk you through some typical ones in the next slide. But in either case, your goal is to either acknowledge them or walk them through what's about to happen or prepare them for the fact that something's really important that you need their attention for. Then the second part of it is to give a proactive summary that gives an appropriate level of detail. So I could summarize that first step as always give the bad news second. The second step, you don't realize this, but again, we talked about this earlier. When you're giving people bad news, you normally say as little as possible. The more detail or reasons that you give them, you're moving toward the pain in a situation where most people move away from the pain. And that sends a very powerful signal to that person that calms them down. Finally, the last part of delivering bad news is every time they open their mouth, acknowledge and empathize with them using some of the acknowledgement techniques we talked about earlier. So if they say something's really inconveniencing them, play that back to them. Make it clear that you realize how much this inconveniences them. That will help shift them into problem solving a lot quicker. Okay, so now if I could have the next slide. Okay, so here's some examples of some good introductions. First is what I call the walkthrough, which is let me walk you through how we handle a situation like this. Let's take a situation that has nothing to do with food service. Somebody comes in and wants something fixed that broke down and it's out of warranty. Every fiber in your body wants to say it's out of warranty. But instead, what I want you to say is things like, let me walk you through how the warranty works. We cover manufacturing defects for 90 days. Since you have had this for 114 days, let's look at some other options. So in a food service situation, you might be talking about, here's how we handle catering events that have a deposit, or here's what happens when we decide to take something on or off the menu. Another good introduction is acknowledging the customer's reaction to a situation. Say, wow, you've invested a lot of time in this event, or I know this meant a lot to you, or I know how much you like, salmon tetrazzini. And then finally, if something's really serious, if something goes badly wrong with an event, or somebody's had a mistake in the food service in the food that they've been served, acknowledge the gravity of that up front. When I developed the book, The Customer Service Survival Kit, then I had the privilege and the honor of speaking to Dr. Nancy Davis, who handles death notifications for the FBI and trains people for how to do this. And they always start those very serious conversations with, I have something important to talk to you about, or I have some bad news to deliver. Can we sit down and talk first? And so what you're doing is you're letting people know that you're about to share something very important with them. So if you're at a point where you're up against the wall and feel like you have no alternative but to say no to people, one of my favorite techniques is what I call the LPFSA. The what? The low probability face-saving alternative. It works because it's low probability, it's face-saving, and it's an alternative. This is where you give the person who is getting the bad news something of value for having come to you, even if it's just hope for the future. Here's a good example of the LPFSA. I'm a huge baseball fan. So one day I swung by a Major League Baseball park on a business trip. So picture this. It's a perfect 70-degree day. It's Father's Day. The home team is a half a game out of first place. The stadium's completely sold out. And so when I got to the ticket window and said, "Hi, I'd like a ticket to the game," what they said to me, again, in this East Coast city, you'd think it'd be like, "Yo, forget about it, hey." What they actually said was, "It's a beautiful day for baseball, and we'd love to see you get into the game. Even though we're completely sold out, here's what we'd like you to do. We have a tradition where our season ticket holders will leave their tickets off at the gate, and we give those away for free if we have them. I can't make any guarantees this close to game time, but we'd still love to see you get in the game." So I went around to each of the gates. Nobody had any tickets. Everyone was as polite and helpful as the people at the ticket counter. And so it struck me that it's now 20 minutes later. I've circumnavigated 10 city blocks. I have no ticket to the game. I'm walking back to my car, happy. And I thought that was fascinating. So I actually emailed the head of human resources for this major league team, and she called me. We had an interesting conversation. And she said, "Yes, we train everybody to say exactly what you heard. And the reason we do that is it calms people down. It keeps everybody safe. Never mind there's bulletproof glass behind the ticket windows. And it just makes everybody feel better." And so in your case, you can use the LPFSA by saying things like, "Well, we don't usually do this, but let me check with the manager first because this is so important to you." Or, "Before we give up on this, here's one last thing that we might try. Here's an alternate dish that we might use instead of the one that you'd like." As long as your LPFSA is not no probability, which would be being unfair and disingenuous to people, then that can be incredibly powerful with people. And so finally, where I want to wrap up today is to talk about how you become immune to people who intimidate you. Up to this point, we have been talking about people who get angry because of the situation, or for people who are getting bad news that they're not going to be happy about. Every single one of you in the audience has had the experience of being an angry customer. And when you have, in all likelihood, you probably felt wronged or unheard. And so the techniques we talk about, where you hear people and feel people and problem solve with them, makes them feel a lot better. There are a handful of people, and yes, they do occur in the food service industry occasionally, where, especially when you're serving important people, is people who use intimidation as a weapon. They grew up realizing that intimidating people worked for them, and so they use that as a tool to get what they want. The way you can tell that you have an intimidating customer instead of an angry customer is when your efforts to hear them, acknowledge them, are met with a block of ice. They don't care if you hear them. They just want to win at all costs. And so now we're in a boundary setting situation. Some of the ways that you handle a situation is, first of all, accept all the things they say to trumpet their own self-importance. So if they say, "Don't you know who I am, and I'm the vice president of this hospital," and all that, say, "Oh, absolutely, you're one of our more important customers." Listen carefully. It doesn't mean you're going to change your boundaries or give them necessarily what they want, but you're accepting that self-importance to take that off the table and disarm them of that weapon. The next technique I like to use in situations like this is what I call fogging. And this comes from the granddaddy of all self-help books way back in the 1970s. When I Say No, I Feel Guilty by Manuel J. Smith, who just passed away a few years ago. One of his techniques is called fogging, and his hypothesis was when you throw bricks at a fog bank and the fog bank doesn't respond, eventually you get tired of throwing bricks at it and you walk away. When you use fogging with a human being, what happens is you acknowledge or agree with whatever you can about what they're saying, with implied "so what." And so, for example, if they come to you and say, "Well, most people usually will bend the rules to host my events," then you can say, "Well, yeah, it sounds like some people have done that for you in the past. I'm sorry that I can't do that." When you use fogging effectively, and especially when somebody's demanding something and you fog them 3 times. Intimidating people can be scary, but they're not stupid. And usually after the 3rd time, they'll understand that they're not getting anywhere, and they'll go away. So picture a situation where somebody comes in and says, I demand the moon and the stars. And you come back and say, okay, I can see why you want that. I can give you half the moon and a quarter of a star, if that would make you happy for now. When they come back and say, that's totally unacceptable, you can acknowledge that's totally acceptable to them. You can restate your boundaries and reintroduce the offer that you're making them. When you do that the first time and they say that's totally unacceptable, and they do it a 2nd time and they say it's totally unacceptable, you have no idea that the 3rd time you do this, they're going to give up and walk away. So stay the course 3 times and watch 95% of these situations melt away. And then finally, the last thing is that people often, if they're intimidators, they'll try to threaten you. They'll say, you know, I'm going to go talk to your boss, or I'm going to post something nasty about you on social media. And it's very critical that you not pour gasoline on the fire when they're making those threats. That's the bread and butter of how they operate. And so if they threaten to talk to your boss, give them the boss's business card and tell them to go ahead. If somebody says, I'm going to post something nasty about you on Facebook, my standard response is, I wouldn't dream of telling you what to say or not say, but I hope we can make you happy. One of the things that I find about social media, and Marcia, of course, gave a great webinar for Alluserv recently on social media, one of the things that you've probably learned from it is that there's a tremendous wisdom of crowds. If people like you as an organization, then one outlier who's criticizing you isn't going to make a difference. And in fact, if you have a good reputation, most people are actually going to swarm to your defense if you have a good reputation. So underreact to threats, stick to your boundaries, let them exhaust themselves and give up, and trust the wisdom of the crowds to support you in those situations. And then finally, where I want to wrap up today is what happens when somebody's really, really angry. I can count on the fingers of probably a hand and a half the people who've truly gone off the rails with me out of the 25,000 or so customer transactions that I've handled in my career. But I remember a lot of them. And in fact, I remember once when I volunteered to handle a really angry customer that had called in. Suddenly, everyone who wasn't on the phones was gathered around my cubicle watching Mr. Customer Service training here, gasping for air under a torrent of abuse and language that would make a sailor blush. That wasn't a comfortable situation for me, and it wouldn't be comfortable for you either. But what's important here is because I know what to say and I know what to do in these situations. Within 5 minutes, this person was talking to me rationally, and within 10 minutes, we left the phone call as friends. And that's the kind of outcomes I want you to have, and I want your team to have in their very worst situation. So as you can tell by now, I have a 3-step process for everything, and this 3-step process is really important to do in order. First club out of your bag is acknowledgement, like we talked about earlier. Remember, the only reason people turn the corner from frustrated to angry is because they feel unheard. And most of us turn into a block of ice and say nothing that acknowledges people when they're angry, which makes them angrier until one or both parties get exhausted and give up. Instead, I want you to go to the highest level of acknowledgement possible and say, wow, that really inconvenienced you. You must be incredibly frustrated. And then when you feel the heat drop even a little bit, you can then start to shift gears into problem solving. And that has 2 steps. Step 1 is to ask good questions. Police officers are trained to use good questions. When I was in an auto accident, they said, you know, can you move your arm? How are you feeling? Good questions both gather information to help you solve the problem, and they move toward the pain in a way that calms the other person down. And then finally, when you shift gears into trying to solve the problems, always frame the solutions in terms of what you can do. So instead of saying, no, I can't put that dish back on the menu, or I can't give you your money back, instead say, here's what I can do. I can give you a discount. I can put you at the head of the line next time. I can refer you out to somebody who might be able to meet your date. And so always frame things in terms of what you can acknowledge and what you can do, and then you're in a negotiating process that hopefully will spool them down from 95% angry to 55% angry to finally in that 35% angry zone where you can actually negotiate with them and solve the problem. So the point I want to make is I want to circle back to the big question that everybody brought up before we did this webinar, which is how do I hold my employees accountable to give good service? And the way you do that is you teach your team how to handle their very worst customer situations. I'm showing my age here a bit. Again, I'm almost 60 years old, and I grew up with a television show called The Addams Family, which is about this creepy family that lived on the outskirts of town. And one of the characters, Uncle Fester, would go around the house and say, "Hey, it's a gloomy day. Let's all go for a drive around the cemetery." My equivalent of being on Uncle Fester was that when a really hot call would come in, I'd sometimes say, "Hey, I got a really angry customer. Come on into my office and listen to me handle this on speakerphone." So when you model how to stick your head in the lion's mouth for people and have fun with it and teach everyone a sense of how you execute in your very worst situations, then people buy into that and feel better and feel good when they come into work in the morning. And when you teach people the same kind of life skills that get used by hostage negotiators and crisis counselors and psychotherapists, they not only do a better job, they take those skills home with them to their families, they have better relationships with their children. My experience is that without ever having to crack the whip, I was able to enforce really high standards, have incredibly good morale, low turnover, great attitudes from people, and improved performance from everybody. And that, to me, was the key in dramatically turning around service performance. And, of course, this also affects your customers in that when you know how to execute, you give people a bedrock on which they learn how to give awesome service to everybody, which is what keeps people coming back to your food service operation. So I'm going to wrap up today with a shameless plug before we open the floor for questions and answers, which is this webinar today is based on my new book, The Customer Service Survival Kit. It was a #1 customer service bestseller when we launched in March, still bouncing around the top 10 on Amazon these days. And our launch campaign is still open. So if you want to buy the book on Amazon.com today, then we've got 15 very high-quality free gifts. If you've ever seen book launch campaigns with free gifts, these are incredibly strong gifts. I have full-length audio programs, self-study programs, complete books from people. My participants are good friends of mine that include 2 New York Times bestsellers, 4 fellow #1 customer service authors. Everybody's a thought leader in their field. So really high content if you want to purchase the book today. I have the website here, customerservicesurvivalkit.com/launch. If you forget the slash, if you just go to the website for the book, there'll be a big button for launch campaign, and we'll walk you through exactly what to do to get all the free goodies. And so, Marcia, I'm going to turn it back over to you in case we have any questions out there. I'm glad to see everybody still on the line here.
Okay. All right. Let's see if there's any questions. Type in your questions if you have any questions. And someone asked that with entitlement, that if a customer is entitled or a staff is entitled, how do I diffuse the entitlement component?
Oh, that's a great question. Most people think that the way you deal with entitlement is to somehow knock them back about it. And if you think back to when you were a teenager and your parents tried that, you know how well that works. So here's the way you deal with entitlement. You validate it. You validate the way that they feel. This is going to make you choke on your tuna fish sandwich, but you frame their position as that of a totally reasonable person. I can see exactly why you want to take every other day off from work. And here's the situation that we're dealing with, is that, our norm is that everyone has to show up at 6 a.m. and be on time. So let's take an example of somebody who comes in late constantly, and they're talking about how the dog is sick and they're getting the kids ready for school and traffic's horrible in our small town. And what I want you to do is acknowledge and validate all of that. I do that till the cows come home. And then finally what I say is, here's the situation, Steve. Most people come in late once or twice a month. You come in late 3 times a week, and it's affecting everybody's morale and our productivity. So where do we go with this? So you engage them to solve the problem. The problem doesn't get solved until the answer comes out of their mouth. But because I've acknowledged all of their excuses and all of their reasons, I've disarmed them of all those weapons. Now they can't bring up the kids or the dog or the traffic because they know I get that already, and they have to problem solve with me. So great question.
Okay. And I don't believe there's any other questions, so I want to thank everyone for being on today. This PowerPoint will be available. It will be available on the Alluserv website, as well as it will be, it is recorded, so it will be available on YouTube as well. Definitely look at that. I'll go back a slide. Let me go back a slide. As you know, we've got to thank Richard for his time, and I wanted to make sure that, again, you see this, that he's very generous today, and he is offering his promotion and 15 high-quality free gifts. As well as if you visit the Alluserv website, in the next week or so we'll be doing some contests, and we will be giving away some as well, but this is an opportunity today for getting some 15 high-quality free gifts, and he definitely has been around a long time, Richard. So I thank you so much, Richard, for offering your expertise.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you all of you for showing up today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be with you today.
And hopefully you'll walk away with handling your customers and your employees, and they won't get under your skin so much. Stay cool, stay dry, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you.
Take care.